I don't own a gun, nor do I have any intention of buying one. Yet I'm here to tell you that you might need to for your own protection, and if you are able, you should acquire one. Check the laws in your state. If the laws are strict, you don't need to, but if they are loose, then you will. If it's strict for you, hopefully that means it's strict for right-wing nut jobs as well. Our laws aren't always applied evenly, and double standards most certainly exist, but it does have to have at least the facade of fairness, or they can and do get sued. That's how Plessy versus Ferguson got struck down. So whatever law is against you, it will be applied, although admittedly not to the same extent, to far-right wackos. So, if you have trouble getting a gun, so does the far right, and therefore you have less reason to get one anyway. Nonetheless, you should join a leftist gun club or donate money. You don't want you do want leftists to have guns. You know, the murder of protesters in this country has always been unofficially legal, but you're going to see more of it in the coming years. As the far right in this country gets more desperate, they're going to turn to violence. In the 1960s, an armed conflict was avoided because the far right found new, insidious ways of hurting black people and the poor. This is no longer available to them, and their mind is so warped by delusion, they honestly believe if black and brown people and other people gain more freedom, that freedom will result in their destruction. First, because they believe black people are rapists and murderers, and secondly, because they view power as zero-sum. The more power black people have, the less they will have. These domestic terrorists will be well-funded, too, by the wealthy, because the wealthy of this country like to see the working class divided. And those working class white people who are racist create division, which is why companies like AT&T fund far-right pundits. And the wealthy also have a considerable amount of influence in the Democratic Party. Look at how many corporate Democrats there are now. I'm not for recklessness. I don't think we should start fights or be violent. But I don't think there's anything wrong with self-defense. And if you don't defend yourself, you will be killed. Nonviolence doesn't exist with a violent opponent. If you are nonviolent with fascists, the result will be your demise. Fascists' main tactic is to kill their enemy. Being peaceful only makes that task easier. And if you're dead, of course, you cannot affect change. There's a reason MLK doesn't make speeches anymore. Moral persuasion doesn't work if you're dead. Now, I'm not sure MLK convinced anyone. Didn't the Marines have to be sent down to the South to enforce integration? I'll tell you why integration occurred. First, it was the Great Migration that created a new society in the North. While there had been violence in many areas, white and black people in other areas did eventually come together. Jazz music and the Harlem Renaissance made white people look at black people differently, and black people gained a new sense of pride that would lead them to demand greater rights. It was white and black Northerners who ended segregation. White and black Southerners had nothing to do with it. Even the younger, more moderate Southerners like George Bush supported segregation. Granted, LBJ was a Southerner, but I highly doubt he was a rabid advocate for integration while rising to power in the South. I would imagine he only started to force it when it became an increasingly important issue for liberals in the North. During this time, the Democratic Party was undergoing the political transition, whereby more and more white people up north became Democrats, and less white Southerners were Democrats. With more white Northerners making up the party, and people who, by now, 30 years after the Harlem Renaissance, and still feeling the Great Migration, and along with it, undoubtedly, the horror stories of what was happening in the South, they, and of course, black Northerners themselves, voted for candidates who were more likely to do something about it. There were two good things that MLK did: the Montgomery bus boycott and the speeches he gave. The boycott was effective in applying pressure on the South, and wasn't as dangerous as some other methods King employed. Same goes for the speeches. If you do not wish to carry a gun, do things like that. But if you do speeches, make sure there's armed security around. You can still be killed. This isn't a guarantee. Malcolm X was killed in the Audubon Ballroom, but he had bodyguards, and he did everything, to my knowledge, to protect himself. And if he didn't, we should not make that same mistake. The point is, the safety of the activist is paramount, which does go into my second point. Don't do hunger strikes or self-immolation. You don't need to hurt yourself to create change. To me, it's the political equivalent of suicide bombers. It's even worse than that, because you're taking yourself down, but nobody else with you. Who is this supposed to convince anybody? The enemy didn't hurt you, so you're not building up sympathy. You hurt yourself. How would we charge the enemy with this crime? Why not just document the violence that they do commit, rather than hurting ourselves or going into dangerous situations where we will be hurt? Do what Grimke did in Slavery as It Is, or all those photographs of beaten slaves that abolitionists took during and after the Civil War to show the effects of racism, or all the photographs of lynched black people in the South. We have new methods at our disposal to capture this violence, what with body cameras and cell phone footage, though. Admittedly, the fascists in this country are trying to circumvent these weapons of ours. We have documentary movies, and of course, maybe you're good at making speeches and appealing to people, to people's humanity or shame. MLK was such a good speaker because he could appeal to people's sense of guilt, and Malcolm X because he could make people feel ashamed while also emboldening and empowering black people to stand up and fight back. He had keen observational skills and was able to detect even the most subtle forms of hypocrisy. Gore Vidal was also an amazing speaker with a tremendous wit, who I believe was the closest real-world counterpart to Sherlock Holmes that's ever existed. A modern-day Cicero, if there ever was one. The spoken and written word are powerful tools that are at our disposal that don't lead to our endangerment. If, like me, you don't have access to a gun to protect yourself, use your intelligence. Be as gentle as sheep, but as wise as serpents. What's interesting is MLK carried a gun on him. He was about nonviolence for building up sympathy, which, as I went over, I still think is ridiculous. But any suggestion that King was about nonviolence because he believed good people should die rather than bad people, no, you're being obtuse. If the only people in America who have weapons are fascists, eventually the only people in America will be fascists.